Well, good morning, FCC. How you doing? Okay, this is kind of awkward. Looks like I'm the only one dressed up. Okay. You know, it's okay. It's okay. It's just Halloween today. It's not like you guys forgot or anything. It's fine. I woke up this morning. I was very excited. I was like, I'm going to dress up. I'm going to see everyone's costumes, everyone's creative genius. It's going to be so exciting. Here I am. Me and Mike. I see Mike over there. Mike's got a costume. I appreciate you, Mike. You and me, we got to stick together. But we are so glad that you are here with us today. And if you come to our costume parade this afternoon from 4 to 6 p.m., I'll give you a second chance. And I'm really excited about it. I'm excited because last year you guys had an amazing turnout, awesome costume ideas, and I get to take pictures tonight. So if you want a family photo, if you want a picture of your costume, come find me. I'll be the floating pink balloon person. But we're so excited you're here. If you're just walking in, welcome. If you're just tuning in with us online, thank you for being here. And this event we have later today is all about families. And as we're moving into the holidays, obviously with today and Thanksgiving and Christmas, we have so many cool things for families and so many awesome opportunities for us as a church family to reach out to and share God's love with our community. And one of the ways that we are going to do that for the month of November is we are actually going to do a toy drive. So starting next weekend, you'll see there are going to be collection bins outside the Pier Building. If you want to donate a new toy, our kids team and our outreach team in December, they're going to have an awesome event where they're going to give these toys. My bubble gum is all over the place. Give these toys to families who might not be able to afford Christmas presents for their kids this year. So if you'd like to donate a toy, again, that's going to be available for the entire month of November, and we'd love it if you would participate in that, and thank you in advance if you do. All right, we are going to stand up here, and we're going to praise our God this morning because no matter what season of life we might be in, we can rest in the promise that our God does not change and He is still good. So why don't you go ahead and sing with us.
I live hard on a wire, hand in the fire for so long. You show me better, a new kind of love. It's ever the one I want. I'm lifting you higher, higher. There's nothing that I'd rather do. A sweet elevation of praises. There's no one I love more than you. I've never knew a love like this before. The kind of life that I can offer on my own. I've seen the world, but I have never been so sure that I want your heart. God, I just wanna be where you are. Where you are. I just wanna be where your love, like nothing I've seen. My wildest dreams don't come close. Help me sing it out. I've never known better than living like this. As the Spirit was moving over the water, Spirit, come move over us. Come rest on us. Come rest on us. As the Spirit was moving over the water, Spirit, come move over us. Come rest on us. Come rest on us. Come down, Spirit, when you move, you make my heart pound. When you fill the room, you're here and I know you are moving. I'm here and I know you will fill me. Calm down, Spirit, when you move, you make my heart pound. When you fill the room, you're here and I know you are moving. I'm here and I know you will fill me. Hope we sing that out this morning. As the Spirit was moving over the water, Spirit, come move over us. Come rest on us, yeah. Come rest on us. As the Spirit was moving over the water, Spirit, come move over us. Come rest on us. Come rest on us. Come rest on us. Fire and wind, come and do it again. Open up the gate sing that one more time. As the Spirit was moved over the water, Spirit, come move over us. Come rest on us. Come rest on us. As the Spirit was moved over the water, Spirit, come move over us. Come rest on us. Come rest on us.
On Christ alone, our chief cornerstone, no other foundation can we build upon. Not philosophy, nor the wisdom of man, all other ground is sinking sand. Upon this rock you build your church, and the gates of hell will not prevail. When we bind and loose, we proclaim your truth, and in Jesus' name we will not fail. We'll never
Crucified, raised up from the dead, let captivity captive. It is finished. Oh, He gave us His keys, His authority. Now we are joining to the praise of His glory.
From the ground up, we're your church. Build your church. Build your church. Build it from the ground up. It's your church. Build your church. Build your church. Oh, sing, build your church. Build your church. Build your church. Build it from the ground up. We sing, build your church, Jesus. Build your church.
ahead and take a seat. A few weeks ago, Scott talked about how being a part of a church, we all have a different role to play, a different part to play. And the cool thing about that is that not one person is more important than the next. You know, we're all called to support each other and to look out for each other's best interests. And you know, maybe you're here today or maybe you're watching online and this is your first experience with church. Maybe you're new to church or you're learning about Jesus or you want to know how you fit in to God's story, to his family, and you're not super sure where to start. Well, we want to offer you this free Bible. This is a resource we want to give to you. And if you are interested in this, you can text your name and the word Bible to 714-623-7323. And some of you, though, I know you're like, oh, that's really cool, but I don't even know where to start with the Bible. The cool thing about this is we've actually added some resources to the front. We have a reading plan. We have some different prompts that will help guide you through the text. So even if you're not so sure where to start with this, we will help you along in that process. So again, if you're new to church, if you're searching and learning and wondering, this is for you. Please, please, we would love to give you one. So text your name to that phone number. One of our staff members will call you this week, connect with you, and get you one of these Bibles. All right, we are in week 5 of Generations, and as you know, over the past few weeks, our band has been covering some different songs from the different generations, just kind of as something fun to take us through the series. So last week, we were in the 90s. We did Bye, Bye, Bye. It was super fun. If you missed it, it's on our YouTube page. You have to check it out. But this week, the voting was very, very close. We are in the 2000s, and the 2000s is characterized by a lot of angsty pop punk and hard-hitting alternative rock. But you guys voted for something a little softer, a little more emotional. So here we go. I'm going to turn it back over to the band for this colorful 2000s classic.
all the things that you do.
Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Happy Halloween to you all. Hope you all have it. By the way, let me just say this. I'm impressed that all of you are here. I'm super impressed if you're here and you brought your kids. Because you're getting up early in the morning. You got a long night ahead of you. You got a lot of candy and all that stuff. So let me just give a shout out to all of you parents. Good luck today. I'm right there with you if it makes you feel any better. But we're glad that you're here, glad you're hanging out with us. Whether you're joining us here on our campus or if you're with us online, just thank you for kicking off your Halloween celebration here with us. And if this is your first time or you haven't been around, we are in the midst of something called Generations. And usually what we do on weekends is we'll spend like anywhere between like 3 to 5 or 3 to 6 weeks talking about like a similar topic. We'll go through a series where we're talking about this book of the Bible or this thing. And so Generations is a series. We spent 6 weeks in this series, but it's more than that. It's an initiative, really. It's a campaign. Generations is about building the future of FCC so that we can become a thriving church, can continue to be a thriving church into the future. And if you haven't watched the previous messages, I really encourage you, if you get a chance to do that, you can go back online to fccHB.com, and there's an archive of all that stuff. And especially if you watch the first one or two, that kind of lays out everything that Generations is about. But at its core, Generations is about 3 things. It's about spiritual growth, which everything we do as a church comes down to that. Everything we do as a church is about how do we become the people that God created us to be? How do we become the people that Jesus is leading us to be? The second one is about church unity, which is huge all the time, especially during a time of a lot of division that exists in our culture right now. And the last one is about debt reduction. Our church has been in debt. For those of you that don't know, we've been in debt for like 30 years. It goes back to even the building of this facility, and some great projects have resulted in that. This building was built. We helped to relocate our school, Huntington Christian School. We rebuilt the facility that we have. And so our debt went to good causes, but we currently sit at $6.5 million in debt. And again, since the 80s, that number's gone up and down, but that's where we are now. Our debt is not a crisis by any means at this point, but it is a threat to us continuing to be a thriving church in the future. So what we want to do in Generations is we really want to, hey, how do we begin to tackle that before it becomes a crisis? And so when you look at just the financial goal of Generations, our financial goal is to bring in $11.5 million over the next 2 years, between now and August of 2023. And the reason that's our goal is because in August of 2023, we have to refinance the loan that we have on our facility. And so at that point, we would love to have been able to pay down our debt essentially in half, which will allow us to funnel a lot more money into ministry. And so this $11.5 million is all-encompassing. This helps us meet our general fund for the next 2 years, and it helps us pay down our debt, that $3 million. And so what's going to happen is next week is the last technical weekend of Generations, and next week I'm going to ask everybody to make the largest 2-year commitment they have ever made to First Christian Church. And we'll get into that a little bit more today. We'll get into it more next week, but we've kind of been going through that. So again, if you haven't been here, really encourage you to go back and watch those. You can kind of get caught up. But we're really excited about the future and where we're going, and this helps us take a big step toward becoming the church that we believe God is leading us to be. Now, as we're going through Generations, our kind of guide through this journey has been Nehemiah. And Nehemiah, if you're familiar with the book of Nehemiah, it's a book in the Old Testament, which is the first part of the Bible. And the Old Testament essentially tells the story of ancient Israel. And Nehemiah is this great story. Nehemiah is by heritage, he's a Jew. But he's born and lives his life away from Israel and away from the city of Jerusalem. The reason for that is because in the year 586 BCE, the Babylonians march in and they conquer Jerusalem. They burn the city to the ground. They leave it nothing but a pile of rubble and ash. They take a majority of the people that live there and they exile them all over Babylon. So the Jewish people who used to live in Jerusalem and in the area around Jerusalem are now living all over the Babylonian Empire. Eventually the Persians come in, the Persians conquer the Babylonians, and the Persians allow exiles to return back to their homelands. And so you have some Jewish people that then go back to Jerusalem, but a lot of them still stay in exile. And so this is where we meet Nehemiah. Nehemiah, actually, when we're introduced to him, he's a butler for the king of Persia. And so he lives in Susa, the Persian capital, and he lives a pretty good life. I mean, you are like the number one servant of the most powerful man in the world. So he lives a pretty cushy life. One day, Nehemiah's brother had traveled to Jerusalem and comes back to Nehemiah, and Nehemiah says, hey, tell me about our homeland. I know that some exiles have returned back home. What's it like, though? What's the situation there? How are things going? And the report that Nehemiah gets is, yeah, man, it's not good. I mean, they've kind of crudely rebuilt the altar. They've crudely rebuilt the temple. And so they're starting to worship God again in Jerusalem. There's a priest by the name of Ezra. He's led a group of exiles back. He's kind of trying to start to teach like elements of Israelite faith and tradition, but it's still bad. I mean, the city's still vulnerable. It's still just rubble and ash. It's not good. And so this report breaks Nehemiah's heart. Nehemiah eventually gets permission from the king to go back to Jerusalem to begin to rebuild the city. And so Nehemiah's plan is we're going to start by rebuilding the walls around the city because that gives the city some safety and some security from its neighbors. Part of the reason they can't rebuild Jerusalem is because they have no protection, they have no organization, they have no army. In the ancient world, you would build cities in a place that you could fortify them with walls. And so having walls are a big deal. So Nehemiah goes back to Jerusalem. He begins to organize this rebuilding of the walls. Things are going really well. They start to face opposition from their neighbors because the people around them do not want them to rebuild Jerusalem. A rebuilt Jerusalem is a threat to their power, to their economy. And so, as we saw last week, Nehemiah has to get his people to work literally like with a hammer in one hand and a sword in the other. Because you got to be ready. Like we're rebuilding and we're continuing this work, but there's also people around us that want to fight us, that want to stop us. So we've got to be ready at a moment's notice to build and to fight. Now, what we're going to see today is that the conflict that Nehemiah faces as he's rebuilding the walls, the conflict doesn't just come externally. There's also internal conflict. There's conflict that he has to deal with that arises from within the Jewish people who are a part of rebuilding these walls. And this is where we are today in Nehemiah chapter 5. And to understand what's going to happen in Nehemiah chapter 5, we have to understand a little bit about the ancient Israelite economic system. That when the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, when they first settle in Israel, after the event we know as the Exodus, where Moses leads the people out of Egypt, they settle in the land, they kind of become this nation. God gives them all of these laws and commands that are going to govern the way their society works. And some of those laws are economic laws that describe, hey, this is the way the economy is going to work. And the ancient Israelite economic laws were always designed to protect the most vulnerable. That was the goal. If you were vulnerable, their economic system was designed to protect you. So when the people first settled in the land, each family was given a plot of land. This land belongs to your family, and the whole point was your family can farm and work this land in order to provide for your family. And so as families would grow, you would have kids, and they would have kids, and they would have kids. You would all continue to work on your family's plot of land. You and I, when we grow up for the most part, we know more than likely that we're going to end up working for someone else. You know, we grew up with goals of, I want to be a teacher. And when you're a teacher, you work for the Department of Education or this particular school, or maybe you're a programmer and you're like, I want to work for this software company. Some of us do go into business for ourselves, but by and large, most of us know that, hey, when we grow up, we are going to work for someone else, a business that someone else owns. That's not how it worked in ancient Israel. In ancient Israel, the ideal was that you worked for your family, and your family stayed together and worked together to provide for your family even as it grew. Now, there were times where families would get in trouble. Crops didn't grow, or situations arised, or whatever it was. It could be a million different reasons. So when that happened, you were allowed to try to get help from other people. You could personally loan money from one person to another. Now, the thing about personal loans in ancient Israel is you were not allowed to charge interest. You couldn't. So if you came to me and said, hey, my family's fallen on hard times, I need help, I could loan you, but I could not make money off of it. Loans were an act of charity. Business loans are a little bit different, but personal loans, you could not charge interest on. You couldn't make money. It was an act of charity. Now, the way a lot of business loans were repaid is you wouldn't necessarily repay with cash or with stuff. You would repay with work. So members of the family that borrowed money might go to work for the members of the people who loaned it. And you would work for them for no more than 6 years. There was a limit to it. And usually it wasn't the patriarch of the family that went to work for them, because the patriarch was needed to run the family business. And if the patriarch wasn't there, the family business would be in chaos. So it might be children or grandchildren, and it wasn't a means of exploiting them. It was actually a means of, hey, this is how we best protect the family. You need to go pay off the family's debt, and we're going to stay here and run the family's business. Now, there was also this built-in cycle. There was this thing called the Year of Jubilee. And every 7 years, every 7 agricultural years, the whole system would reset itself and go back to the way it originally was. And so every 7 years in the Year of Jubilee, all the slaves were freed. Plots of land were restored to the families they were originally given to. So if you fell on hard times and you lost your family land, it ended up with someone else, you knew that when Year of Jubilee came out, it was coming back to your family. All debts were forgiven. And so the Year of Jubilee is like this great reset. So even if things got really, really bad within your family, there was always this hope that you knew, hey, when this came along, everything was going to reset and we were going to be restored and everything would be okay. And so again, the whole Israelite system is designed to protect the vulnerable, to make sure that, hey, you don't lose things, at least permanently, and there's a chance for it to come back, and there's a chance for you to get restored, and even if you fall on hard times, it's going to come back to you. So that's the way the Israelite economic system is designed to work. It's always, it really prohibits the wealthy and powerful from preying on the poor. Basically, you can't long-term get rich and wealthy by exploiting people who are having a hard time financially. That's the way the whole system's structured. So now we go back to Nehemiah. In Nehemiah, you've got, Nehemiah's organizing all the people to rebuild the wall. And they're rebuilding with a hammer in one hand and a sword in the other. And things are getting really, really difficult. And these are people who have jobs. They have families they're supposed to prepare for. And what happens as they're rebuilding the wall is they begin to experience financial hardship. Because the time they would normally begin working, they're rebuilding the wall. And so in Nehemiah 5, there's 3 groups of people now. Internally, 3 groups of people from within the Jewish people that are going to come to Nehemiah and they're going to complain. Because the work on the wall is causing them hardship. And so here's their complaints. Here's what they say to Nehemiah. Nehemiah 5, verse 1. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry. This word outcry, the Old Testament's originally written in Hebrew. This word outcry is the same word that's used to describe the Hebrew people who cry out from their slavery when they're in Egypt. When they're in Egypt and they're slaves and Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is oppressing them, they cried out to God. This is the word. So it's not like a little bit, oh man, we're kind of bummed. No, comes from like a deep place of suffering and anguish inside them. So the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Notice who they're angry at. They're not angry at the people outside who are opposing them, who are going to maybe attack them at any moment. They're mad at their own people. And here's why. Some were saying, we and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and to stay alive, we must get grain. Others were saying, we are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine. Still others were saying, we have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and on our vineyards. Although we are from the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. So you have these 3 groups. We're told about 3 groups that come to Nehemiah. And again, their complaint is not against their enemies. Their complaint is against their own people. They call them their own flesh and blood. And the first group of people that come to complain to Nehemiah say, hey, look, we're just having a hard time. We're doing all this work on the wall. The fact that we're doing this work on the wall means we're neglecting our normal work, which is providing for our family, and it's just tough on our family. Like we want to do the work, but we need to be able to provide for our family. We need to take care of them, and this is tough. That's the first group. The second group comes along. The second group says, look, we're in a more desperate situation than them. Because not only are we having a hard time providing for our families, we're having to borrow money, we're having to get rid of our lands. We're in a desperate situation. The third group comes along, and what the third group adds on to their complaint is not just what they're facing there in Jerusalem, but they reference the fact that they have to pay their 20% taxes to Persia. Persia was in charge, and you pay taxes to who's in charge. And so they're saying, look, we got to do all this. On top of that, we've got to pay this tax to Persia. And we now are in a more desperate situation than these other 2 groups because we've had to sell our sons and daughters into slavery. Our lands don't belong to us anymore. We've lost everything. And again, their point, the reason they're so upset is not just because of the financial hardship they find themselves in, but because there are other Jews that are taking advantage of them and exploiting them. That because who are they borrowing money from? Their fellow Jews. Who are they selling their sons and daughters in slavery to? Their fellow Jews. So you have people within the rebuilding project that are exploiting the suffering of others to get rich and to get wealthy and to build more for themselves, and then you have these other people that are suffering. This is what they're angry about. And so what Nehemiah has to face now is he has this internal conflict. Before, the conflict was external. Hey, we have these enemies around us. They don't like us. They don't want to rebuild our city. We got to be prepared to fight just in case they attack. But now it all begins to turn internal. And you have people exploiting other people, getting rich and powerful and building wealth, and this is a problem. And when Nehemiah hears it, Nehemiah naturally gets pretty upset. He does, and he has every right to get upset. I mean, this is like the last thing you need. We're in this pivotal time of trying to rebuild this city and trying to like get our people, our homeland back on its feet again. And now we have people inside that are just fighting and tearing each other apart. And Nehemiah is kind of a guy that wears his heart on his sleeve. As you read his story, you can kind of always, he makes it pretty clear how he feels. People respond to like his facial expressions and the way he carries himself. And at this point, Nehemiah is really upset. And he's upset for two reasons. And what's interesting is when you look at Nehemiah and his situation here and what he gets upset about, if you go into the New Testament, the second part of the Bible, and you look at the life of Jesus, Jesus gets upset over these same two things. And here's what it is that upsets Jesus and Nehemiah. One is the people of God behaving poorly. As Nehemiah's looking at it going, listen, we're supposed to be God's people. We are Jews. We are the nation of Israel. We're trying to rebuild this nation, this people that was founded on what God had done for us. And now we're cheating each other. We're taking advantage of each other. We're oppressing each other. No, this is wrong. We're not supposed to behave like this. We're supposed to be different. We're supposed to live different. And so Nehemiah, on one hand, is really upset that God's people are behaving poorly. And the other one is the suffering of others. That this makes Nehemiah frustrated. When he looks at other people and he looks at the suffering and he looks at families that are being torn apart and financial realities and people who are hungry, it breaks his heart, but it also makes him angry. But here's the great thing about Nehemiah. Okay, it's really easy to look at other people and to look at how other people behave or to look at the situation of other people and just to get really angry and to get really bitter and But Nehemiah doesn't use this to just generate bitterness in his own heart. It actually becomes a motivation for Nehemiah to do something. See, passion is a great thing, but undirected passion just becomes anger and bitterness and just becomes us saying mean things and posting mean things and just adding to all the anger and bitterness that exists in our world. Directed passion can really fuel some great action. And that's what happens in Nehemiah. Nehemiah doesn't just get angry and start tweeting about how horrible all these people are and going on Facebook or like gossiping. Nehemiah says, okay, here's a problem. I'm frustrated by it. So now I'm going to direct that passion to overcome that problem so that we can create a better future. Because that's the whole point. That's what Nehemiah is trying to do. That's why he left Persia and came down to Jerusalem. Let's rebuild the city. Let's create a greater future. So Nehemiah goes to the wealthy and the powerful, and he directly confronts them. And here's what he says. Verse 5, what you're doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending money people and grain, but let's stop charging interest. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the interest you are charging them, 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil. So Nehemiah goes straight to these people, and he just calls them out. He just walks up to them and goes, hey, how you doing? You're wrong. You're wrong. What you're doing is wrong. It's messed up, and I'm not going to stand for it. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to do A, B, and C. You're going to give them back. You're going to quit charging interest. You're going to restore everything, because this is not what we are about. This is not what it means to be the people of God. The people of God don't do this kind of thing. And so he confronts the issue in order to resolve it, again, in order to create the best possible future for Jerusalem and the people that live there. And not only, this is what is so incredible to me about Nehemiah. Not only does he work to resolve the conflict and the division that exists within the people, but Nehemiah sets the example himself. Because here's what Nehemiah does. Remember, he was a butler for the king of Persia. He's appointed by the king of Persia to be the governor of that region. So Nehemiah has like political authority and political power from the Persian Empire. But here's what Nehemiah does, verse 14 and 16. Moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah until his 32nd year, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor. But the early governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to food and wine. Their assistants also lorded it over the people. But out of our reverence for God, this is what he says, out of our reverence for God, Nehemiah doesn't say, because these people were so great and they were so phenomenal. Nehemiah says, no, it's out of my love for God. I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All my men were assembled there for the work. We did not acquire any land. And so here's what Nehemiah does. Not only does he go and resolve the conflict and says, hey, you're taking advantage of these people and exploiting them, knock it off, give it back. We're going to do this the right way. But Nehemiah, in his own life, he sets the example by saying, you know what? There are certain things that as your governor, I am entitled to. They're my right by the law of the land. This is what the law affords to me. Nehemiah says, but I'm not going to do it. Because I realize that if I take these things that are rightfully mine, that puts a burden on you. And I will not do that. And so what Nehemiah does for that time that he's governor there is he sacrifices all of that stuff that should have been his. He says, because the goal was to rebuild the wall. And I wasn't going to do anything that got in the way of rebuilding a better future for the city of Jerusalem. And so I'm willing to sacrifice what is mine for the benefit of a better future for all of us. And see this right here in Nehemiah chapter 5, this shows us one of the reasons that Nehemiah is such an amazing guy. Because he's not just this like great type A leader that knows how to organize and knows how to get things done. What makes Nehemiah such a great guy is his heart. Is this sacrificial heart where he says, look, in order for us to become who God wants us to be, in order for us to build a better future, yeah, it takes hard work, and yeah, it takes organization, and yeah, it takes unity, but really what it's going to take from all of us if we really want to rebuild Jerusalem and create a thriving future is at its heart, it's going to take sacrifice. And see, honestly, that right there, more than anything, that's why I chose Nehemiah to kind of be our guide through generations. Because Nehemiah understands what we all need to hear, including myself, is that generations, the heart of generations, is about building a thriving future for FCC. And the only way that we do that, is if we all come together sacrificially. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit. We're not leaving Nehemiah, but I want to shift gears a little bit. And I just want to talk for a second, just about faith and Christianity and church in the context of the culture in which we live in our country. For a long time, for decades in our nation, for decades in our culture, faith has really been defined by church attendance. That's it. Like, even I remember when I grew up in the 80s, people would ask, they wouldn't necessarily ask you, like, are you a Christian? They'd ask you, do you go to church? Well, yes, I go to church, and no, I don't go to church. And even when you looked at, like, studies that people would do, like when they would do demographic studies, Christianity was defined by church attendance. If you attended church, you were a Christian. If you didn't attend church, you weren't a Christian. That's what defined it. And so in that mentality, in that mindset of, hey, church attendance equals faith, church attendance equals Christianity, then in that culture, churches, individual churches, became known by their style, basically. That the reason that people would attend churches is because they like the style of that church. And so you had, like, even when I was growing up or when I first started out in ministry, you had churches that were traditional churches, and you had churches that were contemporary churches. And if you were around the church world, you may have heard this term. They had churches that were like seeker-sensitive churches. And so when faith is defined by church attendance, then church is defined by themselves by their style. This is our style of our church. And so people would attend a church based upon that church's style. Why do you go to that church? Because I like their style. And a lot of times that had to do with music. Could have had to do with the way like people would dress. Like, do you dress real traditional? Do you dress really casual? Just the way that church was done. And then COVID hits. But here's what I want to say about COVID. Here's the fascinating thing about COVID, is when the COVID pandemic hits and everything starts to go crazy, COVID doesn't really change anything that's happening within the church. All it does is it accelerates it. Here's a graph of church attendance put together by Gallup. And they're tracking church attendance from 1940. These numbers are hard to see, but I'll point out. From 1940 all the way to 2020. And so what's interesting is between 1940 and essentially the year 2000, church attendance in our nation, this is in all the U.S., hovers right around 70%. It goes up a little bit sometimes, it comes down a little bit sometimes, but again, for 60 years, basically from 1940 to 2000, it hovers right at 70%. And then you hit the year 2000, and it kind of starts this steady decline of going down. And then right here is where you hit COVID, and it takes its deepest drop yet. And obviously, we're not that far past that, so the numbers don't keep going. So what's interesting, again, is you have, hey, we're right at 70%, 2000 hits, it starts to go down. And again, when COVID hits, COVID doesn't do anything new in terms of like faith in our country, in terms of like church in our country. It just accelerates what's already happened, because now as you talk to churches around the country, like as churches have begun to regather, most churches were shut down at least for a little while, at least in their physical gathering, kept doing things online. But you'll talk to most churches around the country and, hey, churches have started gathering, things have kind of returned to normal, but the church doesn't have as many physical people as it did before. Churches are anywhere between 40%, 30%, and like 60, 65% is the most that I've heard of any churches. And so the thing is when COVID hits, that's not a new trend. COVID just accelerated that trend. It accelerated what was already happening. Now, here's in my mind, here's the really interesting thing that the COVID crisis presents. Again, if you go back and you understand that church for a long time, for many decades, was defined by attendance. Christianity was defined by attendance. So what makes you a Christian? I attend church. Well, when COVID comes along, and all of a sudden, the churches are told, hey, you can't physically attend church. That creates a crisis within at least American Christianity. Because for so long, we've defined faith by church attendance, but now what happens when I can no longer attend church? What does faith become? And so you have a bunch of churches all over the country, and their kind of mode of operation for decades has been, hey, come and see, hey, come and see, hey, come attend. All of a sudden, you can't attend. What does it mean then to be the church? See, what we used to rally behind is every week, every weekend, we got together. Now that we can't get together, what is it that we rally behind? And so what happens in this void is there's all these other things that begin to come up, right? And all these other things start to pop up, and you see churches begin to rally behind these things. And here are just some. Politics. Politics becomes a huge issue. I mean, politics has always been big, but it becomes huge. And even things over masks and vaccines. And even things over morality and lifestyle choices and issues. And so because the church can't meet together, we can't define ourselves by the fact that, hey, we meet together. What you see is churches begin to rally around these things. And here's what's really fascinating to me, is now, what is it that churches are known for? They're not known for their style. People don't talk about like, oh, I go to this church because this church is contemporary, or I go to this church because it's traditional. No, what are churches defined by? Churches are defined by where they stand on these issues. Is it a conservative or a liberal church? Because I'm not going to a conservative, or I'm not going to a liberal. What's your church's stance on vaccines or masks? Because if you have to wear a mask, I'm not going there. Could be the greatest church in the history of the world. Jesus could be your guest speaker, but if he's wearing a mask, I am not going. If Jesus is vaccinated, I'm not going to be there. Or vice versa, right? Or is your church affirming, or is it not affirming? Or other moral issues. And so the reason that people go to churches now is not because, hey, I like the style of that church. The reason that people go to church is because, What's your stand on these issues? Because this is, in the absence of gathering together, which is what had defined faith. Again, I'm just talking about that had defined faith. What makes me a Christian? I go to church. I go to church. We never took it further than that. It was never like, okay, but do you actually have a relationship with Jesus? Do you pray? Do you read scripture? Are you surrounded by community? Are you confessing? Are you repenting? Are you walking with God? No, it was just, no, I go to church. Well, you can't go to church anymore, so now what is your faith about? Well, now my faith is about my political view, or my faith is about what I believe about, masks or vaccines, or my faith is about this or that. So you see churches rally around these things, and this is what comes to define churches, and this is why people choose whether or not to attend our church. And here's what we understood really, really early on. And here's like the stance and the posture that we decided to take. Is when you look at the church historically, and I'm talking about like going back to the New Testament, when Jesus begins to talk about the church. For Jesus, the church, it's not a building, it's not an organization, it's not an institution. There was a book I read that described the church, I think it was a beautiful thing. It said the church is a space. It's a space that we all live in. And at the heart of the church is what the New Testament writers called the gospel. And the gospel is this Greek word, and it means good news. And the good news that they were talking about was Jesus. That God came into the world in the person of Jesus. And he died and he rose again. And through Jesus, God is making everything new. New creation, new humanity. Everything. And so at the heart of the church isn't attendance. It's not your politics. It's not what you think about COVID safety protocols. It's not, hey, this is our stance on morality. And again, it's not that having an opinion on any of those things is bad, but that's not the core of the church. The core of the church is the gospel. And so one of the things we did really early on, I'm not saying we were perfect at it or did anything right, is we made the choice that in the midst of all this, we were only going to define ourselves here at FCC by the gospel. Because here's the problem. When you start to define yourselves by any of these things, what you inevitably end up doing is you define yourself by what you are against. And you create an enemy and you vilify them. And so this person is our enemy because they have a different political view, or these people are our enemy because they have a different political view, or this person's our enemy because they have different beliefs about how we should respond to COVID, or this person's our enemy because their lifestyle is different. And so all of these things are rooted in anger that creates an enemy and that vilifies them. And here's the thing. The Apostle Paul makes it clear when you read through the New Testament. And remember, when the Apostle Paul's writing at a time when the church is a persecuted minority in the Roman Empire. Paul's writing actually when Nero is the emperor of Rome. Nero's the guy who will go on to like butcher Christians left and right. I mean, he'll feed them to lions, burn them alive, he'll kill them. Here's what Paul tells the early church. Paul says, here's what you have to remember. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Paul says our real enemy is not an overreaching government. Our real enemy is not our neighbor who has a different view on masks or vaccines. Our enemy is not someone who lives a different lifestyle from us. Paul says our enemy is sin and death and evil that exists in the world. And yeah, to some extent, sin and death lives in us, but it's also bigger than us. It transcends us. It's this thing that exists. Paul talks about sin and death as, it's in us, and we all sin, and because of that, we're all, moving toward death. But Paul says, but the whole point of the gospel is that through Jesus, God is overcoming sin and death. He's overcoming it inside of us, but also all around us. Because sin and death transcends us, and it's bigger than us. And the goal of the church is to bring life and to bring hope. And so the problem is when churches begin to define themselves by what they're against, when churches begin to mix the gospel with any of this other stuff, what it does is it cheapens the church and it cheapens the witness of the church. Because it misses the whole point. There's always going to be issues. 5 years from now, there will be issues. Maybe the same issues, maybe completely different issues. But the DNA of the church is gospel unity. And when you look at the way Jesus talked about the church, and you look at the way the Apostle Paul talked about the church, it was always rooted in that. It wasn't about, hey, our stance on this. No, it's like, hey, we center around Jesus. The word Christian is first used in the book of Acts, and what's fascinating is it's the church in Antioch, and it's not even the church in Antioch. They didn't even call themselves Christians. The people outside of the church called them Christians. And you know why they call them Christians? Because when they look at the people in Antioch, the church in Antioch, they say, all you people do is talk about Jesus Christ. Everything with you is Jesus. Every time I ask you a question, hey, should I be nice to my neighbor? Well, Jesus said this. Well, Jesus this. Well, Jesus that. Just a bunch of little Jesus-y people. Just a bunch of little Christs. That's literally what the term Christian means. Little Christs. And so people outside of them looked at them and said, you know what? Everything about them centers around Christ. That's the DNA of the church. And if a church is going to thrive in the future, if a church is going to become the church that Jesus created it to be, if FCC is going to become the church that Jesus created us to be and wants us to be, it's not because our stance on any of these things. It's because we will have centered ourselves in the person and the work of Jesus and of the message of the gospel. Now, I know that there's people that got mad because we didn't do enough. And there may even be some of you that are thinking like, Scott, why didn't you say more on this? Why didn't you say more on that? Don't you have opinions? Yeah, I have opinions. We all have opinions. Everybody has an opinion. I remember what people told me about opinions. I can't say it because we're in church, so. But I remember, but what's more important to me is what God is doing in my life and in your life and in the world through the gospel, through the message of Jesus. And that is what this church has always been founded on, and it's what it will continue to be founded on. But to do that, to become that kind of church, to be a church that's rooted in the gospel, requires sacrifice. See, we have a vision. We have a 5-year vision. I've shared this several times throughout our generation series, but here it is. I want to share it one more time. Here's our 5-year vision. Is we want to double our kingdom impact by becoming a reproducing, multicultural, and multi-generational church that engages both believers and skeptics. This is the picture that we believe God has for the future of First Christian Church. This is what God wants First Christian Church to become 5 years from now. So that when we look back, that we have doubled and doubling our kingdom impact, again, isn't just about attendance. Yes, the number of people that goes important. I'm not saying that's not, but doubling our kingdom impact is about restoration. It's about changed lives. It's about restored marriages and restored families and people overcoming addiction. It's way bigger than all of that. And so we want to double our kingdom impact. We want to be able to look at and say that, you know what, the city of Huntington Beach is different because First Christian Church is here. So we want to double our kingdom impact. We want to be multicultural, and when I say multi-generational, that doesn't just mean it's the same people on the same address. It means like, hey, we have multi-generations standing next to one another, singing together, learning together, encouraging each other, serving side by side, because that's when the church is at its best. And we want to be a church that plants, actively engages in starting other churches. We've done that to some extent. We want to get more intentional about it, and we want to be a church that engages both believers and skeptics, people who are near from God, people who are far from God. This is our vision. But to get there, to become this, requires sacrifice. And see, this is what Generations is all about. Generations is about us taking the first step, taking the first big step toward realizing this vision, toward embracing this future for FCC. But to become this is going to require that we live the way that Nehemiah did. We have to live sacrificially. And let me let you in on a little thing. We're talking in the beginning about money because that's a part of it. Like we have this debt that is an obstacle, not a crisis. It's an obstacle. We want to deal with it before it becomes a crisis. But can I tell you something? Sacrificing money, that's the easy part. Sacrificing preferences, sacrificing things that we feel like we're owed, that gets even harder. Which is why we're starting with, hey, let's tackle the debt. Because if we want to live sacrificially, that's the first step that we take. And so as a part of Generations, here's what we're asking everyone to do. Here's this giving ladder that we put together. And what we're asking everyone in Generations to do is, would you take a step in your generosity here toward FCC? And so for some of us, man, maybe we've never given to FCC, never have. Maybe this is your opportunity to give for the first time, to say, you know what, I want to be a part of building FCC into the future. I want to be a part of creating this thriving future, so I'm going to give. Those of us who maybe you've given before, will you start to give a little more consistently? Instead of just, hey, randomly, or hey, every now and then when I think about it, will you actually sit down and begin to create a strategy for, hey, this is how I could give? For those of us that we give fairly regularly, but maybe we don't give at a sacrificial level, we just give, hey, here's what I have left over. Will you consider, giving sacrificially, giving a percentage? Will you look at your income and say, you know what, I'm going to give X percentage? If you already give a percentage, will you consider upping that percentage? Maybe 10%. That's in the Old Testament, that's called a tithe. That's a generous number. And for those of us that tithe, hey, would you consider even giving above and beyond that? And so what we're asking everyone to do as we look toward creating the future of FCC, we want to ask everyone, hey, wherever you are on this ladder, will you move up a step? Because that kind of sacrifice, that's what's going to help us build a thriving church into the future. Look, this church has been around for 126 years. This whole reality of COVID and the political mess of our day, this is not the first obstacle our church has ever faced. And in a lot of ways, what we're doing and what churches around the country are doing is church around the country, when churches close down because of COVID, it's not just a matter of relaunching them, it's literally a matter of rebuilding. You talk to church leaders all over the country, it's like, hey, we're having to rebuild our church. And here's the thing, this is not the first time FCC has been rebuilt, and God willing, it won't be the last time. The church is designed to be this fluid community that can change and grow and evolve and adapt. What the church is supposed to do is keep at its core, at its DNA, gospel unity. But all the things around that change, grow, adapt, or rebuild to new worlds, to new realities. Our rebuilding of FCC right now, not the first time it's been rebuilt. And like I said, God willing, it won't be the last. But if we want to become the church God is creating and leading us to be, if we want to create a thriving, gospel-centered community here in Huntington Beach into the future, then it begins with us as people coming together now and following the example of Nehemiah. And so next week, I'm going to ask all of us to consider making the largest 2-year commitment you've ever made to FCC, or really any organization that you've ever given to. And next week, we actually have these cards this week. They have these little commitment cards. If you want to take one, you can take it, and it walks you through some stuff on the back. And has the thing. They're actually in the lobby when you leave. You can grab one. We'll have them next week too. This is a way that you can make your commitment. There's also a way online. We've done it online, and the directions for that are back here. But next week, we're going to ask everybody to make a 2-year commitment. Now, again, you're not held to that. Like, we're not going to come to you at gunpoint and say, you promised this. And I understand that things change, and somewhere along the line, you may have to alter it, or you could even alter it. I get all that. This is just us saying, hey, this is, as I sit right now, this is what I believe God is leading me to do. And so what we're going to ask you to do next week is to turn in one number that is your full commitment over those 2 years, between now and August of 2023. And let me explain this because it's been a little confusing. I'm going to explain it by giving you an example. Let's just say that you already give to the church. Okay, I know not all of us do, and that's okay, but let's just say you already give to the church and you give $5,000 a year. And you look at it and you say, okay, so I'm giving $5,000 a year and the campaign is 2 years. You know what, on top of that, I want to give another $10,000 to go toward debt. Then the number that you would turn in as your commitment would be $20,000. Because it's, hey, here's what I'm already giving to the general fund. I want to give on top of that straight to debt. So next week, we're not asking you to give anything. We're just asking you to make a commitment. So what you would write down, if these were your numbers, here's my $20,000 that I'm going to give the church over the next 2 years. And next week, what we'll begin to do is we'll lay out the specifics of if you already give, if you've already set up giving, and either you do it from an account or you do it like through our website, things like that. That's a great way to schedule reoccurring gifts. If you already scheduled gifts, we'll let you know, hey, here's how you can give on top of that directly to debt. If you've never set up a reoccurring gift before with FCC, we're going to tell you, like, hey, here's how you start setting up that reoccurring gift. And so you can start setting that up so you don't even have to think about it. You can just set it up to come from your bank or your credit card or whatever. But again, the amount that you would turn in next week is not, hey, here's what I want to give the general fund, here's what I want to give toward debt. It's just one number. This is my commitment. And then next week we'll get into the specifics of how you can give your extra toward debt or how you can just start to begin to give. But this week, what I want you to do is I want you, if you haven't already, to begin to think and begin to pray. And here's the reminder that I'm going to leave us of. Here's I think when you look at Nehemiah chapter 5, here's what we learn from Nehemiah about churches and any churches. A church's greatness is equal to its level of sacrifice. What makes a church great is not the quality of the music they have or the great buildings that they have or the quality of the speaking. Or like those things are all great and those things are all important and they're fun. But what makes a church great, and really you could substitute this word greatness out for effective or successful or anything. I just chose greatness. What makes a church great is the sacrifice of the people who are a part of it. See, what makes Nehemiah great, it's not just so much his organizational skills or his strategy. It's what he was willing to sacrifice to realize God's vision and dream for the city of Jerusalem. What has made FCC great, what makes FCC great, and what will continue to make us great is the level to which we are willing to sacrifice. We set the cap on how great this church can be by how much in our own lives we are willing to sacrifice to realize the vision to become who God is leading us to be. Let me pray. Father, I thank you so much for your love for us. I thank you for everything you've given to us. God, I thank you for the privilege we have to be a part of this church. I've said it throughout the series that we are the inheritors of the legacy that goes back to 1895. And this church has been through so much, and God willing, it will be through so much more. And Father, I pray for us this week as we begin to think. As now, we've been talking about this for a while, but now's the moment where we really got to decide, hey, what is my part in helping us realize the future? What is my part in helping us become the church you're creating us to be, you're leading us to be? And God, my hope is that during this time as a church, this time of all kinds of crazy division and anger, that we will come together united around the gospel and our belief that Jesus Christ is the hope of the world. And that we would center our identity and our foundation and our hope and our future on that and on that alone. Because God, when a church comes together around that, they're unstoppable. Unstoppable. And the early church thrived in such a hostile environment, not because they had great strategies and not because they had great facilities, but because they chose to value one another, and above all, they loved you. God, that's where it begins. Help this to be another moment in FCC's history where we come together in a sense of sacrifice and love to create the future that you have for us. God, we thank you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Holy Spirit, come rest on us. You're all we want. You're all we want. Holy Spirit, come rest on us. You're all we want. So calm down, Spirit, when you move, you make my heart pound. When you fill the room, you're here and I know you are moving. I'm here and I know you will fill me. Calm down, Spirit, when you move, you make my heart pound. When you fill the room, you're here and I know you are moving. I'm here and I know you will fill me.
Thank you so much for being here with us today. If you would like to take communion before you leave, we have that available down in the chapel for you. Also, if you're watching online, we have a communion guide on our recap page as well. We hope you have a fun and safe Halloween today. Hopefully, we'll see you later today at our Halloween costume parade. But other than that, we love you guys. Have a wonderful week. We'll see you next weekend.